In the final decades of the 13th century, Scotland existed as a kingdom, perpetually balanced on the knife's edge of survival. The land itself seemed carved by divine hand for resistance. Glens that swallowed armies whole, rivers that ran cold and swift, enough to break cavalry charges. Yet for all its natural defenses, Scotland found itself under the boot of a foreign king, who viewed the Northern Realm not as a sovereign nation, but as a rebellious province. Edward Longshanks, King of England, had systematically dismantled Scottish independence following the death of Alexander III and the subsequent crisis of succession. The coronation stone had been seized from Scone and carried south to Westminster. Scottish nobles who might have resisted found themselves either bought with English lands or crushed beneath English steel. By 1296, Scotland existed as a nation in name alone, its autonomy stripped away. Through military force and political maneuvering, into this world of occupation and resentment, William Wallace emerged from relative obscurity. Born sometime around 1270, likely in Elderslie in Renfrewshire, Wallace came from the minor nobility, a family position just above the common folk, but far below the great magnates, who played their games of thrones and allegiances. When Wallace was a boy, Scotland was a place where English soldiers would take grain without paying for it, and where Scottish landowners suddenly found themselves under English law. The sources remain frustratingly silent on the specifics of Wallace's early years, but the outline emerges clearly enough. A young man raised in a culture that remembered sovereignty, educated enough to understand what had been lost, positioned socially in that dangerous middle ground. The exact catalyst that transformed William Wallace from anonymous landholder's son to outlaw remains disputed by historians. Medieval chronicles, written decades after the events, give different versions of the story. Some say it was English soldiers who killed his father. Others say English officials may have killed his wife or someone he loved. What matters more than exactly what happened is the harsh reality it reveals. By 1297, Wallace had crossed the line, from subject to rebel, from member of the occupied population to active resistance fighter. Unlike the great nobles, who calculated their rebellions in terms of landholdings and titles, Wallace operated with the freedom of the dispossessed. He had nothing left to lose except his own life. And in a Scotland under English occupation, even that life felt as fragile as morning dew. The political situation that led to Wallace's rebellion was incredibly complicated. When John Balliol was king, many saw him as little more than a puppet under Edward's control, earning the nickname Toom Tabard, a mocking term for an empty and powerless figure. When Balliol attempted to assert Scottish independence by allying with France, Edward responded with overwhelming force, stripping Balliol of his crown and reducing Scotland to occupied territory. The great nobles played their own intricate games, switching allegiances as circumstances dictated, always calculating which side would preserve their estates and advance their claims. For the common people and minor nobility, however, the calculation was simpler. and starker. English occupation meant foreign law, foreign officials, and the systematic extraction of resources to fund Edward's wars in France and Wales. Wallace understood viscerally what the great nobles seemed willing to ignore: that a people could not remain a people if they accepted permanent subjugation. His rebellion began small, a matter of ambushes and raids, the classic tactics of guerrilla warfare, employed by the weaker force against a stronger occupier. He gathered around him other dispossessed men, other minor nobles, and common folk who had crossed their own points of no return. Together they moved through the forests and glens, striking at English supply columns, attacking isolated garrisons, making the occupation expensive in blood and treasure. Wallace possessed something the great nobles lacked: credibility among the common people. He was not playing both sides, not hedging his bets with estates in England and Scotland. He was committed absolutely to the cause of Scottish independence. And that commitment proved infectious. The turning point came at Stirling Bridges in September 1297, when Wallace and Andrew Moray led a Scottish force against a much larger English army, attempting to cross the narrow bridge over the River Forth. The battle demonstrated Wallace's grasp of tactics and terrain. Rather than meeting the English in open field combat, where their heavy cavalry could dominate, Wallace waited until a portion of the English force had crossed the narrow bridge, then struck with devastating effect. The English vanguard found itself trapped between the Scottish spears and the river, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat effectively. The resulting slaughter sent shockwaves through both kingdoms. An army of occupation had been destroyed, not by the great Scottish nobles, but by a minor knight and his band of patriots. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Common men properly led and motivated had achieved what the great lords had failed to accomplish. They had defeated English arms in open battle. The victory at Stirling Bridge propelled Wallace into a position of unprecedented authority for someone of his social status. He was named Guardian of Scotland, a title that theoretically made him the kingdom's military leader and chief administrator in the absence of a king. For a man who had been an outlaw mere months earlier, it represented an extraordinary elevation. Yet the position came with impossible burdens. Wallace commanded no great estates that could fund a sustained military campaign. He could not call upon the feudal obligations that bound lesser nobles to their lords. His authority rested entirely on his military success and his reputation. Moreover, the great Scottish nobles watched him with suspicion and jealousy. Men like Robert Bruce saw Wallace as a useful weapon, but not as a legitimate long-term leader. The class distinctions that defined medieval society ran deep. A minor knight might lead in crisis, but he should not presume to govern. Wallace attempted to use his brief window of power to prepare Scotland for the inevitable English response. He raided into northern England, partly to gather supplies, and partly to demonstrate that Scotland could strike back at its occupiers. He attempted to organize Scottish defenses and bring the fractious nobility together in common cause. But Edward Longshanks was not a man to accept humiliation lightly. The English king had spent his reign conquering. Wales had been subjugated, Gascony defended, Scotland occupied. He would not allow a minor Scottish knight to undo his work. Edward assembled a massive army, the kind of overwhelming force that only a wealthy kingdom could feel, and marched north with methodical determination. The armies met at Falkirk in July 1298, and there Wallace learned the harsh limits of patriotic courage when facing professional military force on unfavorable terms. The Scottish schiltrons, formations of spearmen arranged in defensive circles, held initially against English cavalry charges, but Edward's army included massed longbowmen, and in the medieval battlefield equation, archers trumped static infantry. The English archers stood beyond the reach of Scottish spears and poured arrows into the densely packed formations. The schiltrons, unable to advance without breaking formation and unable to retreat without disintegrating, could only endure the arrow storm. When the formations finally broke, the English cavalry swept through, turning defeat into rout. Wallace survived Falkirk, but his military reputation did not. A guardian who lost the nation's army could not remain guardian. He resigned or was forced from power. The sources disagree on the precise mechanism, but the results was the same. William Wallace returned to the shadows, from which he had emerged. For the next 7 years, Wallace became a ghost, haunting the edges of Scottish resistance. He could no longer command armies, but he could still fight. He refused all English offers of peace that required submission, while other Scottish nobles made their accommodations with Edward, receiving back their lands in exchange for oaths of fealty. Wallace remained intransigent. He traveled to France, possibly seeking French support for Scottish independence, possibly simply surviving in exile. He moved through Scotland organizing raids and keeping alive the embers of resistance, even as English occupation tightened its grip. To Edward and the English administration, Wallace represented something more dangerous than a military threat. He was a symbol of resistance that refused to die, a reminder that conquest was not the same as acceptance. As long as Wallace remained free, as long as stories circulated of his continued defiance, the English hold on Scotland remained incomplete. Edward recognized that Wallace's symbolic power had to be broken, absolutely and publicly. The king issued orders throughout Scotland and England that William Wallace was to be captured by any means necessary. Substantial rewards were offered. English officials applied pressure to Scottish nobles who might know of Wallace's whereabouts. The manhunt intensified through 1304 and into 1305, as Edward moved systematically to eliminate the last vestiges of organized Scottish resistance. The great nobles had submitted. The castles had fallen or been garrisoned. Only Wallace remained, a thorn that Edward was determined to extract, with maximum prejudice. On the 5th of August, in the year 1305 near Glasgow, agents serving Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who had aligned himself with English rule, finally captured William Wallace. The circumstances remain murky. Whether Wallace was betrayed by a trusted associate, whether he was taken by force or through trickery, the sources do not conclusively say. What mattered was the result. The man who had eluded English forces for years, who had moved through Scotland as an outlaw and a legend, was now in chains. Word of his capture spread quickly through both kingdoms. In England, it was received as news of a dangerous criminal's apprehension. In Scotland, it was heard with the dull despair of a people who had watched their champions fall one by one, until only Wallace had remained, and now even he had been taken. Wallace was transported south under heavy guard, a prisoner of the English crown, being brought to face English justice. The journey from Scotland to London covered hundreds of miles, and Wallace made it as a captive, bound and guarded, no longer the free warrior moving through his own land, but a prize being delivered to his enemy. The symbolism of that journey was not lost on anyone. Scotland's champion was being dragged in chains to the capital of the occupying power, where he would face a tribunal whose verdict was already certain. There would be no real trial, no genuine adjudication of guilt or innocence. Wallace was to be made an example, a demonstration of what happened to those who resisted English authority with such persistence and success. London in 1305 was the beating heart of Edward's kingdom, a city of perhaps 80,000 souls, wealthy by medieval standards. Its streets a chaos of merchants and craftsmen, beggars and nobles, the stink of tanneries mixing with the smell of fresh bread from bakeries. The Thames, flowing brown and sluggish through the city's center, carrying both commerce and sewage. It was a city that had seen executions before. Thieves hanged at Tyburn, traitors beheaded at Tower Hill, heretics burned at Smithfield. But the execution of William Wallace was to be something special, a theatrical demonstration of royal power and royal vengeance. That would be discussed for years to come. Wallace spent his final night imprisoned in the house of William de Leyra, a prominent London citizen in the Fenchurch Street area. The house had been commandeered to hold the famous prisoner in the hours before his execution. Guards surrounded the building, not because there was any realistic chance of rescue, but because the symbolism demanded it. The dangerous rebel had to be seen to be held securely, contained by English might, even in his final hours. Inside that house, William Wallace faced the reality of his situation, with whatever courage or fear he possessed. The sources give us no access to his thoughts, no window into his emotional state. We know only that he existed in that liminal space, between life and death. The hours when a man knows exactly when and how he will die. When the abstract concept of mortality becomes a specific appointment that cannot be missed or avoided. The morning of August 23rd, broke over London, with the usual late summer weather, warm and close. The kind of day when crowds would gather willingly for spectacle. Wallace was brought forth from his overnight prison, not to face a genuine trial, but to be subjected to a formal accusation and sentencing. Westminster Hall, the great royal chamber with its massive timber roof, served as the venue for this judicial theater. The hall had witnessed coronation banquets and parliamentary sessions, had heard the business of kingdoms conducted within its walls. Now it would bear witness to the systematic legal destruction of William Wallace. The charges against Wallace were comprehensive and damning, carefully constructed to paint him not as a prisoner of war or a political rebel, but as a traitor and a criminal beyond the bounds of law or mercy. He was accused of sedition, of homicide, of sacrilege and burning churches, of robbery and arson throughout the lands he had raided. Most damningly, he was charged with treason against King Edward, refusing to submit to English authority and making war upon English forces and subjects. The legal reasoning was carefully constructed. By English law, Edward was the rightful sovereign of Scotland. Therefore, Wallace's resistance constituted treason against his lawful king. That Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward, that he fought for Scottish independence rather than personal gain, that he considered himself a subject of the Scottish crown rather than the English. None of this mattered. Within the framework of English law, as applied by English judges, in an English court, Wallace reportedly responded to the treason charge with the only defense that made sense from his perspective. He could not be a traitor to a king he had never acknowledged as his sovereign. He had fought for Scotland's independence, for the restoration of Scottish sovereignty, not in rebellion against legitimate authority, but in resistance to illegitimate occupation. It was a defense that was morally coherent, but legally worthless within the context of the Westminster Hall proceeding. The judges had not assembled to determine guilt or innocence, but to pronounce a sentence already determined. Wallace was found guilty on all charges, with the kind of speed that made clear this was a formality rather than a genuine adjudication. The sentence matched the severity of the charges and the depth of Edward's desire to make of Wallace an example that would echo through history. Wallace was condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most extreme punishment available under English law, reserved for traitors of the highest order. The sentence was designed not merely to end life, but to inflict maximum suffering and humiliation, to break the body systematically and publicly, to transform the living man into a grotesque warning against resistance. More than that, the sentence included provisions for the disposition of Wallace's remains that underscored the symbolic importance of his execution. His body was to be divided and displayed in different locations throughout Scotland and England, a macabre demonstration that Scottish resistance had been literally dismembered. From Westminster Hall, Wallace was prepared for his final journey, through London, to the place of execution at Smithfield. He was stripped naked or nearly so, dressed in rags, then bound to a hurdle, a wooden frame that could be dragged behind horses. This was itself part of the punishment. The condemned man forced to lie flat while being pulled through the streets. Every bump and stone felt directly. The humiliation of being dragged like an animal through the crowds. The procession moved through London's streets, from Westminster to the Tower, and then to Smithfield, a distance of several miles, taking perhaps an hour or more, depending on the crowds. The route had been chosen deliberately to maximize public viewing, to ensure that as many Londoners as possible witnessed the famous rebel brought low. The crowds that lined the streets presented a complex tapestry of medieval urban society. Merchants in their good wool cloth stood alongside laborers in rough homespun. Women held children up to see the spectacle. Street vendors sold food and ale to those who had come to watch. Some in the crowd likely cheered, seeing Wallace as the English authorities had painted him, a dangerous rebel, a murderer, an enemy of proper order, who deserved his fate. Others might have watched in silence, uncertain what to feel about this distant Scottish conflict and its broken champion. Some may have felt pity, seeing not a traitor, but a man who had fought for his homeland and lost. Medieval crowds at executions were rarely simple in their emotions, combining elements of entertainment seeking, moral judgment, religious reflection, and simple curiosity. For Wallace, dragged naked or nearly so through hostile streets, the journey represented a systematic assault on dignity and identity. Everything that had made him a leader, his physical prowess, his commanding presence, his reputation for courage, was being stripped away piece by piece. He was reduced to suffering flesh, unable to stand or walk, unable even to shield himself from the crowd's gaze, forced to passively endure every moment of his final hours. The physical pain of being dragged over rough cobblestones and through filth was accompanied by the psychological torture of knowing what awaited at journey's end. Wallace had witnessed executions before. He knew precisely what was coming. He had time to contemplate each stage of the punishment that would be inflicted upon his body. Time for fear and pain to build, in anticipation of horrors not yet arrived. Smithfield, the execution site, was an open area northwest of the city walls, a place used for markets and livestock trading, but also for public executions and other events requiring space for large crowds. A gallows had been erected specifically for Wallace's execution, with a high platform that would ensure good visibility for the assembled spectators. English officials had planned this execution with the same attention to detail they might give to a coronation or a royal wedding. Every element served a purpose. Every stage of the proceeding was designed to maximize both Wallace's suffering and the political message Edward wished to send. The king himself was not present. Monarchs generally did not attend executions personally, but his will and his vengeance were embodied in every aspect of the proceedings. Wallace was removed from the hurdle and taken to the gallows platform. The first stage of his execution was hanging, but not the relatively quick death by broken neck that long drop hanging could provide. Instead, Wallace was hanged by a short rope, strangled slowly, lifted just enough that his toes might touch the platform or dangle above it. His body weight slowly cutting off air while consciousness remained. The executioner and his assistants were experienced in their grim work. They knew how to keep a man on the edge between life and death, how to strangle him almost to the point of unconsciousness, and then revive him for the next stage. Wallace hung there, fighting for air, his vision narrowing, his lungs burning, while the crowd watched and the executioner judged when to cut him down. Before Wallace could die from strangulation, he was cut down and immediately subjected to the next stage of his punishment. While he was still conscious or semi-conscious, still capable of feeling, the executioner performed an emasculation and disembowelment. This was the most agonizing stage of the execution. Deliberate torture inflicted, while the condemned man remained conscious enough to experience it. The human body can survive for some time, even with catastrophic abdominal wounds, and the executioner's skill lay in prolonging consciousness through the maximum amount of suffering. The crowd's reaction to this stage of the execution likely ranged from horrified silence to sick fascination to deliberate turning away. Even in a medieval society more familiar with public violence than modern sensibilities can easily grasp, this kind of methodical torture represented an extreme of human cruelty. Some spectators would have understood it as justice, the righteous punishment of a traitor who had killed Englishmen and burned English towns. Others would have seen it as excessive, a demonstration of royal power that crossed into tyranny. Still others would have processed it through a religious lens, seeing Wallace's suffering as a secular parallel to martyrdom, a man enduring agony for his beliefs and his loyalty to his homeland. At some point during or shortly after the disembowelment, William Wallace died. His heart, which had kept beating through all the previous torments, finally stopped. His head was removed first, to be taken and placed on a pike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning and a trophy. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, another to Berwick, another to Stirling, and the fourth to Perth. Major Scottish towns where English authority was established, where Wallace's divided remains would serve as gruesome reminders of what happened to those who resisted English rule. The political calculation behind this final disposition was coldly logical. Wallace's body could not be allowed to become a shrine, a focal point for continued Scottish resistance. By dividing him and displaying the pieces far from each other. Edward ensured that there would be no grave to visit, no single location where Wallace's memory could be venerated. Moreover, by displaying the quarters in Scotland itself, Edward sent a message directly to the Scottish people. This is what happens to your heroes. This is the fate of those who defy English authority. The message was clear. Resistance is not merely futile, but grotesquely punished. And even the most celebrated rebel ends as rotting meat, displayed for crows to pick. Yet, in death, William Wallace achieved something that Edward's brutal spectacle could not prevent. He became immortal as a symbol. The very extremity of his punishment testified to how seriously the English king took the threat he represented. Men are not subjected to such elaborate executions unless they are genuinely feared, unless their example requires the most dramatic possible refutation. Edward's vengeance meant to destroy Wallace's legacy, instead enshrined it. The story of the Scottish knight who refused to submit, who fought for independence, even when every practical reason argued for surrender, who endured execution with courage, rather than purchase life with submission. That story proved impossible to suppress. In the years following Wallace's death, Scotland continued its struggle for independence under new leadership. Robert Bruce, who had calculated and compromised, and played the political game, eventually committed fully to Scottish independence, and succeeded where Wallace had failed. Not because Bruce was a better warrior or a purer patriot, but because he was a king, with the legitimacy and resources that Wallace had lacked. Yet Bruce himself acknowledged the debt. It was Wallace who had kept resistance alive through the darkest years. Wallace who had demonstrated that Scots could defeat English arms. Wallace who had embodied uncompromising commitment to independence. The seeds Wallace planted with his rebellion, his victories, and ultimately his martyrdom, grew into the Scottish victory at Bannockburn and the eventual restoration of Scottish sovereignty. The historical William Wallace remains difficult to separate entirely from the legend that grew around him. The earliest detailed account of his life, the verse chronicle written by Blind Harry in the 1470s, was composed more than a century and a half after Wallace's death, and mixed fact with fiction in ways that modern historians struggle to untangle. Wallace became a figure of legend precisely because he served a need. He was the commoner who led, the patriot who never compromised, the martyr who died rather than submit. Different eras and different people have projected onto Wallace the qualities they valued or needed. To 19th century romantics, he was the freedom fighter resisting tyranny. To 20th century nationalists, he was the embodiment of Scottish identity. To modern audiences, he has been repackaged as a cinematic hero, noble savage, and revolutionary icon. Yet, beneath the layers of legend and interpretation, certain facts remain solid and significant. William Wallace did emerge from relative obscurity, to lead Scottish resistance against English occupation. He did achieve a stunning victory at Stirling Bridges that proved Scottish forces could defeat English armies. He did serve as guardian of Scotland, holding together fragile resistance when the great nobles wavered. He did refuse all offers of peace that required submission to English authority. He did remain defiant, even when continued resistance meant exile, poverty, and constant danger. And he did die in London on that August day in 1305, subjected to the most brutal execution the English legal system could devise. His body literally torn apart and scattered as a warning to others who might follow his example. The final hours of William Wallace's life, from his imprisonment to his journey through London to his execution at Smithfield, represented a collision between individual human courage and institutional state power. Edward Longshanks wielded all the authority of kingship, all the resources of the English state, all the mechanisms of legal and physical coercion that medieval monarchy could muster. Wallace had only his own conviction and his willingness to endure suffering rather than betray his cause. In purely practical terms, Edward won. Wallace died in agony. His body was destroyed. Scottish resistance was temporarily crushed. But in symbolic and historical terms, the victory was less clear. Wallace's execution became part of his legend, rather than the end of it. The brutality of his death testified to the threat he represented, and the fear he inspired in England's king. For those who watched Wallace die that day in Smithfield, the spectacle meant different things, depending on perspective. English authorities saw justice done, a dangerous rebel appropriately punished, order restored, through the visible application of sovereign power. Some in the crowd perhaps saw a criminal receiving his due, but others, particularly any Scots who witnessed the execution or heard of it, saw something else. They saw a man who had been defeated but never conquered, whose body could be broken, but whose defiance remained intact until his final breath. They saw that some things, loyalty, conviction, identity, could not be taken by force, could not be extinguished, even by the most brutal application of power. The meaning of William Wallace's life and death has been contested and reinterpreted across 7 centuries. He has been claimed by Scottish nationalists and British Unionists, by romantic poets and hard-headed historians, by filmmakers and politicians, and schoolchildren learning national myths. The historical record provides frustratingly incomplete answers about who exactly he was. His birthdate uncertain, his early life obscure, even his physical appearance unknown except in the vaguest terms. What remains undeniable is the impact of his choice to resist when resistance seemed hopeless, to continue fighting when every practical calculation argued for surrender or accommodation. In the end, William Wallace matters, not because he was flawless, or because he succeeded in every endeavor, He matters because he represented the principle that some things are worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible. That submission to injustice is itself a form of death, worth resisting. His execution was meant to be a demonstration of power, a theatrical warning against rebellion that would echo through Scotland and beyond. Instead, it became something its orchestrators never intended, a demonstration of what people will endure rather than surrender their identity and independence. The scaffold at Smithfield was meant to be the end of William Wallace's story, the final brutal chapter that would close his rebellion and silence his example. History proved otherwise. The execution ended the man, but immortalized the symbol. And symbols prove far more difficult to kill than flesh and blood. 700 years have passed since that August day when William Wallace died in London. The Scotland he fought for has changed beyond anything he could have imagined. The England he resisted has transformed from medieval monarchy to modern democracy. The bitter conflicts between the kingdoms eventually gave way to political union and shared institutions. Yet Wallace's name and story persist, carried forward by each generation that finds meaning in his example. He remains the patriot who would not compromise, the rebel who accepted martyrdom rather than submission, the commoner who led when nobles failed, the symbol of resistance that even the most brutal exercise of state power could not extinguish. In death, torn apart and scattered, William Wallace achieved the only form of immortality available to humans. He became a story that people continue to tell, a symbol that continues to resonate, a reminder that the human spirit can defy even the most overwhelming power. When conviction runs deep enough, and the cause seems worth the ultimate sacrifice. What do you think about Wallace's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories that bring the past to life.